Hi and welcome to English Odyssey. Are you learning English? Great, let's learn English with a very interesting story. Don't forget to subscribe, like and comment. Let's get started. Rolex watches are famous all over the world. Many people want to own a Rolex, but why are they so special and how did this famous brand start? There is a bit of mystery around Rolex. It is known for being very successful and also very secret. This book is about the amazing story of Rolex. It is a story that starts with a young man who had nothing. He was an orphan, meaning he had no parents to take care of him. But this young man, Hans Wilsdorf, built Rolex into the most famous watch brand in the world. How did he do it? Let's go back to the beginning. Hans Wilsdorf was born in Germany in 1881. He had a happy childhood. His parents, Anna and Johann Wilsdorf, loved him very much. He grew up in a home filled with happiness and laughter. But when Hans was only 12 years old, something very sad happened. Both of his parents died. Suddenly it was a big shock for young Hans. In a short time he lost both his mother and his father. Suddenly Hans was an orphan. He had no parents to look after him. He had to leave his home and go to live with his uncles. They decided to send him to a boarding school. Boarding school is a school where children live and study. It was a new place for Hans, away from everything he knew. At first, Hans was very sad and missed his parents a lot, but slowly he found a way to feel better. He started to focus on his studies. School became his escape. He worked hard and found that learning helped him forget his sadness for a while. He was especially good at learning languages. He liked to learn new words and how to speak in different languages. This interest in languages would be very important for him later in his life and in his career. This is the start of the Rolex story, a story of how an orphan boy from Germany created a watch brand that everyone knows and admires today, to learning about watches after school. Hans moved to Switzerland. He started working for a company called Kuno. This company was big and sent many pocket watches to other countries. Hans was good at languages. He spoke German, English, and French. Because of this, he got a job as a clerk. He also wrote letters for the company Kuno and also made some of their own watches. This was good for Hans. He could learn how watches were made. He started to understand how all the small parts worked together. He learned about the watch industry. It was a new world for him. At first, his job was a bit boring. He had to wind hundreds of watches every day. It was the same thing again and again. But slowly, Hans started to like watch making. He saw the work and skill in each watch. He began to think about making perfect watches himself. He really liked the idea of creating something special. After some time in Switzerland, Hans wanted to do more. In 1903, he moved to London. He got a new job in another company. This job was different. He had to find new people to buy watches. He had to sell watches and get more clients. This was a bigger job with more responsibility in London. Hans learned even more about watches. He saw that some watch brands were more popular than others. He started to understand why. He realized that it was not just about making good watches. It was also important to make people know about your brand. Marketing was very important. He learned that good marketing could make a brand famous and successful. Hans enjoyed his jobs, but he had bigger ideas. He wanted to use what he had learned for himself. He started to dream of having his own company. He wanted to be his own boss. He felt ready to do something bigger than just working for other people. He knew he had the skills and the knowledge about watches to start his own business. A new watch company in 1905. Hans Wilsdorf was only 24 years old, but he had a big idea. He decided it was time to start his own business. He wanted to make and sell watches. Hans had saved some money from his jobs, but he needed more to start a company. He asked his brother-in-law, Alfred Davis, for help. Alfred Davis believed in Hans and gave him the money he needed together. Hans and Alfred started a company. They called it Wilsdorf. And Davis, the company was based in London at first. They did not make their own watches. Instead, They bought watches from Switzerland and sold them in the UK. Switzerland was famous for making good watches. Hans knew this from his time working in Switzerland. At this time, most people in the UK used pocket watches. Wristwatches were not popular. People thought wristwatches were only for women and were like jewelry. Some people told Hans that wristwatches were not strong. They said the small parts inside would break easily. They also thought wristwatches were not accurate, and pocket watches were better, but Hans did not agree. He thought wristwatches were the future. He believed they were more useful and looked better than pocket watches. Hans said that one day pocket watches would almost disappear and everyone would wear wristwatches. He knew that wristwatches needed to be made better with higher quality parts, even though many people said wristwatches were not a good idea. Hans listened to his own ideas. He used almost all of the company's money to order a very large number of wristwatches from Switzerland. It was one of the biggest orders for wristwatches ever. At that time, people thought he was crazy to buy so many wristwatches. Even Alfred Davis, his business partner, was not sure. It was a good plan. Hans wanted to make sure the watches were excellent. He met with many skilled watchmakers. These were masters of watchmaking. Hans wanted to learn from the best. He tried to learn something new from each watchmaker he met. He wanted to understand every part of making a watch. He used his old contacts from Switzerland to import the best Swiss watch parts with these parts. Wilsdorf and Davis started to make high-quality wristwatches. Hans was ready to show the world that wristwatches were not just for women, and they could be accurate, strong, and very popular. For the Rolex name begins, Hans knew that to make good wristwatches he needed good parts. He used parts made in Switzerland because they were known for being high quality, but quality alone was not enough. He also needed people to remember his brand. This meant he needed a good name for his watches. The story of how he found the name Rolex is interesting. Hans said he tried to make up a name by mixing letters. He tried many combinations, but none felt right. Then one day, when he was going to work, he said the name Rolex just came to him like a whisper in his ear. No matter how he really found the name, it was a great choice. Rolex is a short name. It is easy to remember. People can say it easily in any language. Also, Rolex sounded stylish and strong. Hans thought it was perfect, so Hans started to put the name Rolex on the face of his watches. This helped people start to know the brand. It was a way to show that the watches were special. A few years later, the company changed its name. It became Rolex Watch Co. Limited. This showed how important the name Rolex had become. Soon Rolex watches started to become famous for their quality. In 1910, Rolex was the first wristwatch to get a special paper from Switzerland. This paper said that the watch was very precise, meaning it kept time very well. Then in 1914, something even bigger happened. A Rolex watch was tested at a famous place called the Kew Observatory in Britain. They gave it a Class A rating. This was the highest rating a wristwatch could get. No other wristwatch had ever gotten this before. These awards were very important. They showed everyone that Rolex watches were not just any watches. They were watches of high quality. People started to connect the name Rolex with good quality and good timekeeping. This helped Rolex become more popular and sell even more watches. The name Rolex was beginning to mean something special in the world of watches. 5 clever ways to sell the world changed a lot when World War I started in 1914 for Rolex, based in London. This was a difficult time. Hans Wilsdorf, the boss, was Germany, and Britain became enemies during the war because of his German background, and named some people in London became suspicious of Hans. Also, the British government put new taxes on things coming into the country, especially luxury items. This made it more expensive to bring Swiss watches to the UK. Hans Wilsdorf had to make a big decision to avoid problems and taxes. He moved the Rolex headquarters to Switzerland. Switzerland was a neutral country in the war, meaning it did not take sides. Moving to Switzerland was a smart move for Rolex. While many businesses struggled during the war, Rolex did well. Wristwatches became very popular with soldiers. They were much easier to use than pocket watches in battles. Soldiers needed to check time quickly, and wristwatches were perfect for this. Rolex watches were strong and reliable, which soldiers needed. Hans Wilsdorf was very good at marketing. He knew how to make people want Rolex watches. He did something very clever. He gave Rolex watches to famous and successful people. Explorers, athletes and racers started wearing Rolex. People saw these heroes wearing Rolex and thought, if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. This made Rolex watches seem like they were for people who achieved great things. Rolex also used advertisements in newspapers and on the radio. This was newer. At the time, Hans understood that telling people about Rolex in many places would help sales. He was ahead of his time in using these methods. In 1926, Rolex made a big invention, the Oyster watch. It was the first waterproof watch people could buy. To show how good it was, Hans had a great idea. He knew a woman was going to swim across the English Channel. He gave her a Rolex Oyster to wear during her swim. After swimming for over 10 hours in cold water, the watch was still working perfectly. This was amazing news and made headlines everywhere. People were very impressed that the watch was truly waterproof. To keep showing off the Oyster's waterproof quality, Hans told Rolex shops to do something unusual. He asked them to put Oyster watches in fish tanks in their shop windows. They put real fish swimming around the watches. People walking by were very surprised and curious. This clever way of showing the watch in water made people remember that Rolex Oyster watches were waterproof. These smart ideas helped Rolex become even more famous and successful. Rolex, Forever Rolex, kept making new things. In 1931, they made a special part for watches called the perpetual rotor. This was very clever. It meant the watch could wind itself when you moved your wrist. Before this, people had to wind their watches by hand every day. This new part made Rolex watches even better and easier to use. Rolex also continued to work with famous people and events. When people flew over Mount Everest, for the first time they wore Rolex watches. A man named Malcolm Campbell, who was very fast in cars, also wore a Rolex when he broke a speed record. This helped people see Rolex as a watch for people who did amazing things. In 1945, Rolex had been a company for 40 years. To celebrate, they made a new watch called the Datejust. This watch was special because it was the first automatic watch that showed the date. You could look at your watch and see not just the time, but also the day of the month. This was another big step for watches, but at this time, Hans Wilsdorf had some sad news. His wife Florence died. She had been with him since the start of Rolex. This was a very sad time for him. He started to think about what would happen to Rolex after he was gone. He wanted to make sure Rolex would continue to be a great company in the future. So in 1946, Hans Wilsdorf did something very important. He started a foundation called the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. He gave all of his shares in Rolex to this foundation. This meant that Rolex was no longer owned by him, but by the foundation. This foundation is still in charge of Rolex today. It is a special kind of organization. It does not have owners in the normal way. The foundation uses the money Rolex makes for good causes. Some of the money goes to help people learn about watchmaking. Some money also goes to other charities and to help education. The Hans Wilsdorf Foundation is very private. Not much is known about how it works. We know it owns Rolex and that it gives money to charity, but many details are kept secret. Some people think this secrecy is just a way to keep the wealth and power of Rolex safe. Because it is a foundation, Rolex does not have to pay some taxes like normal companies. This special structure helps Rolex to stay independent and in control of its future, just as Hans Wilsdorf wanted. 7. Why is Rolex expensive after Hans Wilsdorf died? Rolex continued to be successful in the 1970s and 1980s. Many Swiss watch companies had problems because of new quartz watches. These watches used batteries and were cheaper. But Rolex did well. Even during this time today, Rolex watches are very expensive. For example, a Paul Newman, Daytona, Rolex sold for a lot of money. Even normal Rolex watches cost thousands of dollars. People ask, why are they so expensive? We can all see the time on our phones, so why pay so much for a watch? Some people say Rolex watches are expensive because they are made very well, they are made to last a long time. This is partly true, but it is not the whole story. You can buy other watches that last a long time for less money. First, Rolex is more than just a watch. It is a symbol of being rich and successful. Many famous people wear Rolex watches, from singers to kings. Rolex is seen on people who have done great things. This image of success is made by Rolex's marketing. Rolex spends a lot of money on marketing. They sponsor big sports events like Wimbledon tennis and Formula One racing. These are events watched by wealthy people. They also pay famous sports stars like Roger Federer to wear Rolex watches. Movies also show famous people wearing Rolex. Rolex does use good materials to make their watches. They test everything carefully. This costs more money. Making watches by hand is also expensive. Rolex pays good salaries to the people who make the watches. They also have labs to research and create new watches. However, some people who know about watches say that making a Rolex is not as expensive as the price you pay. They say a Rolex that sells for a lot of money might cost much less. To make the rest of the money is for advertising and making the brand seem special. Rolex wants to be seen as special and not easy to get. They only sell watches in special shops. They do not have sales or give discounts. Sometimes they even buy back old watches from shops so they are not sold cheaply. Rolex also made another brand called Tudor. Tudor watches are similar to Rolex but cost less. This way Rolex can keep its main brand expensive and special. It seems Rolex makes fewer watches than people want to buy. This makes people wait a long time to get a Rolex. Some people say Rolex does this on purpose to keep the demand high and the prices high. This makes Rolex even more wanted. Rolex is like a Vlyn. Good, this means that when the price goes up, more people want it. Normally, if something is more expensive, fewer people buy it. But with Rolex, the high price makes it more attractive to some people, even though Rolex is expensive, partly because of its brand. It can be a good buy. Rolex watches keep their value, or sometimes they even become worth more money over time. This is like an investment. Not many other watch brands do this in the beginning. Rolex was seen as a useful watch for Mannequin-J, but through clever marketing, Rolex became a luxury brand. Now it is one of the most famous and valuable brands in the world. Hans Wilsdorf started with nothing and built something amazing. Rolex's story teaches us important lessons about business and branding. 8. Keeping watches. Special Rolex watches are famous and expensive, but why, some people ask, if the price is really about how much it costs to make them. It's true that Rolex watches are made with good materials, and lots of care experts say that making a Rolex might cost much less than what they sell it for in shops. Some guess that Rolex makes a lot of profit from each watch, maybe even many times more than the cost to make it. So what makes up the high price? A big part is marketing. Rolex spends a lot of money on showing their watches with famous people and at important events. This makes people think of Rolex as special and luxurious. Think about other watches that are also very well made. Some of these are just as good as Rolex or even better for some watch lovers, but not many people know about them. These brands don't spend as much on advertising. They are not as famous as Rolex, and they often cost less. Rolex knows who they want to buy their watches. They aim for people who want to show they have done well in life. It's for people who want to own something special and recognized to stay special. Rolex does a few clever things. They only sell watches in their own shops or in special shops that are allowed to sell Rolex. You won't find Rolex watches with discounts or cheap offers. If shops have old watches that are not sold, Rolex sometimes buys them back. This makes sure that Rolex watches are never seen as cheap. Rolex also created another brand called Tudor. Tudor watches look a bit like Rolex, but they cost less. This way, people who cannot afford a Rolex can still buy a good watch from the same family, but Rolex stays special and expensive. It seems Rolex makes fewer watches than people want to buy. This is on purpose. When it is hard to get something, people want it more. Sometimes you have to wait a long time to buy a Rolex. This long wait also makes people think Rolex watches are very special. And in demand, Rolex is like a Vlin. Good, this is a funny idea. Usually if something costs more, fewer people buy it. But with things like Rolex, it's different. When the price is high, more people want it. This is because owning a Rolex shows you have money and good taste. Even though Rolex watches are expensive when you buy them, they often keep their value. Sometimes they even become worth more money later on, especially old models. So some people see Rolex as a good thing to buy, not just a watch, but also something that keeps its value or even becomes more valuable. Hans Wilsdorf, the person who started Rolex, was very clever. He built a brand that is known all over the world for being special and expensive. Even today, Rolex uses many of the ideas. He started to keep their watches special and wanted by many people. Hey there, just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.